November 25th, 1863, Chattanooga, Tennessee. The air is so cold it burns the inside of your lungs. The Tennessee River bends gray and sluggish below the bluffs. The morning fog is burning off the valley floor, slow and theatrical, like a curtain being pulled from a stage. And what it reveals is a wall. Not a metaphorical wall, not a strategic obstacle on a map. A literal wall of earth and rock and timber, rising 500 feet above the valley floor, almost perfectly vertical, its crest bristling with Confederate rifle pits and artillery, the cannon mouths aimed straight down like the eyes of a god who has already decided what happens next. That wall is Missionary Ridge, and Ulysses S. Grant, standing on Orchard Knob with a dead cigar clamped between his teeth, has just ordered approximately 23,000 men to walk up to the base of it, not up it, to the base of it. Take the rifle pits at the bottom, stop there, wait for orders. That is the plan. That is the limit of what Grant has asked. He didn't ask them to climb it because climbing it is not a military option. It is not a tactical decision. It is a suicide note written in human bodies. But something is about to happen on that hillside that no general ordered, that no war college ever taught, that no battle plan ever imagined. Something that will leave Ulysses S. Grant, the toughest, most cold-blooded commander in the Union Army, gripping his field glasses with white knuckles, his jaw slack, watching in a mixture of rage and awe and pure animal disbelief. And standing 10 feet away from him, watching the same impossible sight, is the man who made it possible without ever giving a single order. General George Henry Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. The man who 2 days earlier had looked Grant directly in the eye and told him no. History has a short memory and a terrible habit of crowning the loudest man in the room. Grant gets the statue in Washington. Sherman gets the burning march through Georgia. Sheridan gets the cavalry charges and the headlines. And George Thomas gets a footnote, a nickname, a paragraph in a chapter that most people skip. That is a crime against the truth. Because what Thomas did at Chattanooga, specifically what he refused to do, and then what he allowed to happen in its place, is one of the most extraordinary acts of military judgment in American history. It is the story of a man who understood something about war that even Grant, for all his genius, had not yet learned. Patience is not weakness. Patience is the sharpest weapon in the arsenal. To understand why Thomas refused Grant's most dangerous order, you have to understand who George Thomas was, not the general, the man. He was born in 1816 in Southampton County, Virginia, a Southerner, deep-root Virginia soil, the same red clay that Robert E. Lee walked on, the same colonial tradition, the same culture of honor and aristocracy and deference to the gentleman class. His father was a farmer. His family owned enslaved people. By every measure of blood and geography, George Thomas should have been in a gray uniform. But Southampton County is famous for one other thing. In 1831, when Thomas was 15 years old, Nat Turner's rebellion tore through the county like a fire through dry grass. Enslaved men rose up and killed their enslavers. Dozens of white families were murdered in their beds. The Thomas family hid in the woods. Young George Thomas helped get his mother and sisters to safety, hiding them from the violence in a ditch, crouching in the dark while the world burned around them. The rebellion was crushed. Turner was hanged. But the event carved something into Thomas that never healed. He had seen the human cost of the system he was born into. He understood at 15 years old that the institution his culture rested upon was built on a foundation of terror that could collapse without warning. He went to West Point. He was a serious, deliberate student, not flashy, not charismatic. He graduated 12th in the class of 1840. He served in the Mexican War alongside Grant, alongside Sherman, alongside Lee. He performed well. He was brave and methodical and careful with his men's lives in a way that officers of the period often were not. When the Civil War broke out, George Thomas made a choice that destroyed his relationship with his family permanently. He stayed with the Union. His sisters in Virginia were so ashamed that they turned his portrait to face the wall. They never spoke to him again. They told people their brother was dead. His family treated him as a traitor to his blood, his soil, and his kind. He received no more letters from Virginia. He sent none. A lesser man would have been shattered by this. Thomas absorbed it. He internalized it. He became even more deliberate, even more steady, because he had already given up everything to stand where he stood. He had nothing left to prove to anyone except the men marching behind him. This is the man Grant was dealing with at Chattanooga. And understanding that background is the only way to understand why Thomas refused. Now let's go back to October 1863, because the situation when Grant arrived at Chattanooga was not a military problem. It was a military catastrophe masquerading as one. 6 weeks earlier, at the Battle of Chickamauga, the Union Army of the Cumberland had been torn apart. It was one of the worst Union defeats of the entire war. Confederate General Braxton Bragg hit them in the Georgia woods with everything he had. Longstreet's corps, freshly arrived from Virginia by rail, punched a hole through the Union center wide enough to drive a brigade through. The Union line collapsed. General William Rosecrans, the Union commander, panicked. His staff panicked. His corps commanders panicked. Men started running. It became a rout, except for one place on the line. Thomas was on the left, and Thomas did not run. He gathered every unit he could find. He pulled men from the chaos, placed them on Snodgrass Hill, and told them they were not moving. Confederate waves hit him for hours. They hit him from the front. They hit him from the flanks. Bragg threw division after division at that hilltop. Thomas stood there like a piece of the earth itself, refusing to yield, holding the line until the rest of the army could escape. That afternoon saved the Army of the Cumberland from annihilation. The soldiers knew it. They gave Thomas the name that would follow him forever: the Rock of Chickamauga. But the aftermath was not a triumph. The army retreated into Chattanooga, and Bragg's Confederates took the high ground surrounding the city, Lookout Mountain to the south and Missionary Ridge to the east. They controlled the roads. They controlled the river supply lines. They simply sat up there on those ridges and waited. The math was simple and brutal. The Union Army in Chattanooga was being slowly starved to death. The supply wagons that had to reach the city were taking a 60-mile detour over a mountain road that turned to mud soup every time it rained. By October, rations were cut in half, then cut again. The horses and mules were dying first, thousands of them. Their carcasses lined the roads. When the horses died, the wagons stopped. When the wagons stopped, the food stopped. By the time Grant arrived, the soldiers in Chattanooga were eating quarter rations, hardtack crawling with weevils, a cup of parched corn, and a prayer for dinner. Grant received command of the Military Division of the Mississippi on October 17th. His first act was to replace Rosecrans with Thomas. His second act was to open the Cracker Line, a clever engineering solution that cut the supply route down to a manageable distance through the Lookout Valley. Within days, supplies were flowing. The starvation ended, but Grant and Thomas now had to share a command space. And they were the two most different men in the Union Army. Grant was a coiled spring. He woke up every morning thinking about how fast he could move. He hated waiting. He viewed delay as a form of cowardice. He had spent his career watching other Union generals stall and hesitate and find reasons not to fight. It drove him half mad. His instinct, always and forever, was forward. Attack, move, hit again, hit harder. Thomas was geological. He did not move until he was ready. He did not attack until he had looked at every angle, accounted for every variable, and felt in his bones that his men had what they needed to do the job. He was the kind of general who would spend an extra hour making sure the ammunition wagons were correctly positioned before he moved a single regiment. His staff sometimes found this infuriating. His enemies found it predictable, but his soldiers found it something rarer. They trusted him, because when Thomas finally moved, men did not die for nothing. When Thomas gave an order, the math had already been done. The ground had already been scouted. The supply line had already been secured. He wasn't gambling with their lives on a hunch. He was spending them with precision, which is the only morally defensible way to spend a human being in a war. Grant did not yet understand this about Thomas. What he saw was a slow general in a fast war. The tension crystallized on November 7, 1863. Sherman's forces had arrived. Grant had a plan. He wanted to attack immediately before Bragg could be reinforced, before winter closed the campaign season. He wanted Thomas to lead a diversionary assault on the Confederate center at the base of Missionary Ridge. Just a demonstration. Pin them down. Keep Bragg's eyes forward while Sherman swings around the northern end of the ridge. Thomas said he was not ready. Grant stared at him. His men, Thomas explained, had just emerged from a month of near starvation. They were physically depleted. They had been on reduced rations until 2 weeks ago. Their equipment was in disrepair. The artillery horses were in poor condition. The men needed more time to rebuild their strength and confidence before he would ask them to advance under fire. Grant did not hide his frustration. He had come to Chattanooga to fight, not to wait for the men to feel better. There was a war happening. There were deadlines imposed by weather and politics and the calendar. The election of 1864 was already a shadow on the horizon. Every week the Army sat in camp was another week the peace Democrats could point to as failure. Thomas did not flinch. He was not defiant. He was not theatrical. He did not make a speech. He simply looked at Grant with those steady, dark eyes and explained the military reality with the patience of a man explaining long division to a bright child. "The men are not ready," he said. "When they are ready, I will move." Grant backed down, but he didn't forget it. In a letter to Washington, Grant wrote with thinly veiled exasperation that Thomas was slow and that the Army of the Cumberland needed more spirit. The word slow in Grant's vocabulary was not a neutral descriptor. It was a condemnation. It was the same word Lincoln had used about McClellan. In Grant's mind, calling a general slow was almost the same as calling him useless. He began quietly making inquiries. He asked if Sherman could take over. He considered replacement options. He was seriously thinking about removing George Thomas, the man who had saved the Union Army at Chickamauga, from command at Chattanooga. That fact alone tells you everything about the pressure both men were under and everything about the fundamental difference in how they understood war. Grant measured success by speed and aggression. Thomas measured success by preparation and inevitability. Both men were right. Both men were also dangerously wrong in the other's domain. By late November, the stars aligned. The men were ready. Sherman was in position. The plan was set. 3 days of battle, November 23rd through the 25th. Day 1, November 23rd. Thomas was ordered to make a demonstration, a show of force, to test the Confederate defenses at Orchard Knob, a small hill in the valley between the city and Missionary Ridge. Grant expected it to be a probe, a few regiments of skirmishers feeling out the ground. Thomas looked at the hill and saw something Grant's plan didn't account for. If taken, Orchard Knob would give the Union a forward observation point that commanded a view of the entire Confederate position. It was tactically valuable, not just symbolically. He organized not a skirmish line, but a full-scale assault formation. 23,000 men dressed their ranks in the valley in full view of the Confederates on the ridge above. They looked like a parade ground review. They looked like a painting of war. Then they stepped off and took Orchard Knob in under 30 minutes with minimal casualties. Grant was surprised, then pleased. Thomas had done more than ordered, better than expected, and faster than predicted. But the important day, the day history turns on, was still coming. November 24th, the battle on Lookout Mountain went to General Joe Hooker. He took it in what newspapers would romantically call the battle above the clouds. The Confederate position on Lookout Mountain, which had seemed impregnable, collapsed relatively quickly because Bragg had already pulled most of his forces off it. The important fight was always going to be Missionary Ridge, and on November 25th, Grant's plan hinged on Sherman. Sherman was supposed to attack the northern end of Missionary Ridge, roll up the Confederate right flank, drive down the ridge, and collapse Bragg's entire position. It was the decisive blow. Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland were assigned a supporting role, a diversion, a demonstration to pin the Confederate center, while Sherman did the real work. There is something in that word, demonstration, that you need to sit with for a moment. These were the men who had been besieged in Chattanooga for a month and a half. These were the men who had watched their horses die of starvation. These were the men who had fought at Chickamauga, who had seen their army break and run, who had been called the whipped Army of the Cumberland by Sherman's troops, who showed up fresh and well-fed from Mississippi with their clean uniforms and their full ammunition pouches and their casual, dismissive comments about the ragged survivors in the trenches. Being told to play the diversion was not a neutral military instruction. It was an insult wrapped in orders. Thomas knew this. He felt it in the way his men looked at him. He saw it in the set of their jaws and the quiet fury behind their eyes. These men did not want to pin the Confederate center. They wanted to crack it. They had something to prove that transcended the battle plan. They had been the forgotten army, the beaten army, the slow army in a fast man's war. They wanted Grant's eyes on them for the right reason. Thomas said nothing about any of this. He received his orders. He gave his officers the plan. He told them clearly and without ambiguity to advance on Missionary Ridge, take the Confederate rifle pits at the base of the slope, and hold that position. Take the rifle pits at the base. Stop. Hold. Those were the orders. But Thomas watched his men form up on the morning of November 25th, and some part of him, deep in the geological stillness of his judgment, understood something about what was about to happen that the orders could not contain. At 3:40 in the afternoon, the signal gun fired, 6 gunshots in sequence. The Army of the Cumberland stepped off. What happened next is one of those moments in military history where the record and the reality diverge so completely that historians are still arguing about it 160 years later. The men of the Army of the Cumberland walked across the open valley floor under Confederate artillery fire. They took casualties as they crossed. Men went down, but the line did not break. They hit the Confederate rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge, and they took them in a furious, terrifying rush of bayonets and clubbed muskets. Confederates ran, some surrendered. Within minutes, the first line of rifle pits was theirs. They were supposed to stop. They did not stop. Here is why. And this is the detail that every version of this story gets wrong when it tries to reduce the moment to accident or instinct or luck. The Confederate rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge were positioned in the worst possible tactical location. Someone, somewhere in Bragg's command, had made a catastrophic error. The rifle pits were at the bottom of the slope, but the Confederate artillery on the crest of the ridge above could not depress their cannons low enough to fire on the rifle pits without hitting their own men on the slope. There was a dead zone, a strip of the hillside where the Confederate artillery was completely blind. The Union soldiers figured this out in about 30 seconds. They also figured out the other half of the equation. If they stayed in the rifle pits, they were being fired on from above. The Confederates on the crest could shoot straight down at them. Lying flat in the captured pits was not safety. It was a killing floor. The only place on that entire slope where they were not being shot was about 20 feet up the hill, inside that artillery dead zone. And so they went up, not because of a death wish, not because of blind heroism or reckless courage, though there was plenty of both. They went up because the mathematics of survival pointed up. Staying at the base was death. Going up was the only direction that made tactical sense. And once they started going up, a thing happened to those men that only happens in war when a unit transcends its own fear. They remembered Chickamauga. They remembered being called the Whipped Army. They remembered the half rations and the dead horses. They remembered the clean uniformed men from Sherman's command looking at them with pity. They remembered every slight, every assumption, every dismissal. They screamed. They clawed up the rocky slope on their hands and knees. Officers grabbed rocks and pulled themselves up. Men with bayonets used them to stab into the earth for handholds. They bled from their hands. They could not see the top. They could only see the next 5 feet of rock and scrub oak and enemy fire. They went up anyway. Grant was watching from Orchard Knob. The moment he realized what was happening, his jaw tightened. He turned to Thomas. He did not shout, but the question came out hard and flat. "Thomas, who ordered those men up the ridge?" Thomas looked at the hillside. He watched his soldiers crawling up a 500-foot slope into Confederate artillery and rifle fire, without orders, without a plan, without any logical military rationale except the raw fury of men who had been underestimated for too long. He looked back at Grant. He said he didn't know. Grant turned to General Gordon Granger, the Corps commander nearest to Thomas. Granger shrugged. He didn't know either. Grant stared at the ridge. His voice dropped to something very quiet. "It's all right if it turns out all right, but if it doesn't turn out all right, someone is going to answer for it." It was not a compliment. It was not the beginning of a speech about American heroism. Grant was furious. He had a plan. The plan was Sherman. This, whatever this was not the plan. This was 23,000 men deciding by collective instinct to ignore orders and assault a position that every military textbook said could not be taken by a frontal charge. If those men failed, if the charge broke halfway up and rolled back down in a bloody rout, the whole battle was compromised. Thomas would lose his command. Officers would face court-martials, and Grant would have to explain to Washington why he let the Army of the Cumberland go rogue in the middle of a battle he was supposed to be controlling. For 15 minutes, no one on Orchard Knob spoke. They just watched. On the ridge above, Bragg's Confederate soldiers looked down at the sight coming up at them and felt something they had not expected to feel. They had held Missionary Ridge for 2 months. They had watched the Union Army starve below them. They had fired down into this valley so often it had become routine. The ridge was 500 feet of natural fortress. No rational force was going to charge straight up it. But the men coming up at them were not being rational. They were being something older and more dangerous than rational. They were being righteous. They were hungry men who had eaten too much shame, and they were spending it all at once. The Confederate line on the ridge began to crack before the Union men even reached the top. Bragg's army on Missionary Ridge was not the same army that had crushed the Union at Chickamauga 2 months prior. The relationship between Bragg and his corps commanders had deteriorated into open warfare of its own. Longstreet was gone, sent to Knoxville. Breckinridge hated Bragg. D.H. Hill had been relieved. The army was fractured at its command level, and fractured armies do not hold ridges when 23,000 screaming men come up at them from below. The Confederate line broke, not at one point, at multiple points simultaneously. Men grabbed their flags and kept coming. Union soldiers reached the crest and planted their colors. The Confederate position collapsed with a speed that stunned both sides. Men who had been grimly holding their position looked left and right, saw their flanks gone, and ran. Bragg watched his army dissolve from his headquarters and reportedly screamed that it was a disgrace, that his men had been ordered to hold, that there was no reason for the collapse. He was technically correct. There was no reason. No military logic supported what had just happened. A frontal assault up a nearly vertical ridge against an entrenched enemy defending with artillery should not work. It worked. The Army of the Cumberland was on the crest of Missionary Ridge, and the Confederate Army of Tennessee was running into Georgia. Grant remained very quiet as the magnitude of it sank in. His plan had failed. Sherman had not broken through on the northern end. The dramatic flanking movement, the decisive blow he had designed, had stalled against unexpected Confederate resistance at Tunnel Hill. The battle Grant planned to win with Sherman had instead been won by an unauthorized charge that Thomas had not ordered, had not stopped, and had not been able to explain. And here is where Thomas reveals himself most completely. He did not gloat. He did not look at Grant and say, "I told you so," about the readiness of his men. He did not point out that Grant had spent weeks calling the Army of the Cumberland slow and had assigned them a supporting role while positioning Sherman's men for the glory. He did not do any of the things that a man with a bruised ego and a justified grievance might have done in that moment. He said, "The orders were executed." 4 words, Grant wrote the report. In it, he gave Sherman extensive credit. He mentioned Thomas in professional terms. The credit for the actual decisive action of the battle, the charge up the ridge, got scattered among various unit commanders, various regiments, various moments of spontaneous bravery. The larger strategic picture, the narrative of how the battle was won, pointed toward Grant's design, even though Grant's design had specifically excluded the action that actually won it. Thomas accepted this. He went back to his headquarters. He reorganized his corps. He prepared for the next campaign. He did not write letters to sympathetic journalists. He did not give interviews criticizing the battle plan. He did not collect evidence to present his case to Washington. He was a soldier who had fought to win, and the fighting was done. But why? Why did Thomas refuse Grant's original order to attack before his men were ready, and then appear to let his men disobey the order to halt at the rifle pits? This is the question that the history books answer wrong, usually by ignoring it entirely. Thomas refused the early attack order because he understood something about the psychology of a beaten army that Grant, who had never commanded a truly demoralized force, did not yet understand. An army that has been starved and humiliated does not fight on empty stomachs and wounded pride. It fights on confidence, and confidence cannot be issued from a supply depot. It has to be rebuilt, meal by meal, day by day, officer by officer, until the men believe again that they are capable of doing the thing being asked of them. Sending them up against Missionary Ridge in early November, hungry and hollowed out, with their ammunition carts still poorly organized and their artillery horses still dying by the road, would not have produced a miracle. It would have produced another Chickamauga, another rout, another retreat, another wave of peace Democrats pointing at another Union disaster and asking why this war was still being fought. Thomas was not slow. Thomas was correct. And the second part, the moment his men went up the ridge, when ordered to stop, is even more revealing. Because Thomas did not stop them, he could have. He was watching from a command position on the valley floor. His staff officers were watching. He had signal corps officers with flags. He had couriers on fast horses. If he had wanted to halt the charge the moment he saw his men leaving the rifle pits, he could have tried. The order would not have worked, because the men were already beyond the point where an order could reach them in time. But he could have tried. He didn't try, because he saw what Grant, staring at the ridge with white knuckles, had not yet seen. He saw the dead zone in the artillery fire. He saw the Confederate positions crumbling on the crest before a single Union soldier reached the top. He saw the fragility of Bragg's fractured command in the way the defensive fire was uncoordinated and panicked. He saw, in short, that it was going to work. And a general who stops an attack that is going to work because it wasn't in the orders is not a disciplined officer. He is a coward hiding behind paperwork. Thomas was not a coward. He was the only general at Chattanooga that day who understood both halves of the equation. You prepare until you are ready. And when the moment comes that preparation was for, you do not flinch from it because it looks different than you expected. In the years that followed, history built monuments to Grant. It built monuments to Sherman. It told the story of the Western theater as Grant's story, as the story of an aggressive, cigar-smoking genius who drove the Confederate armies into the earth through sheer iron will and relentless forward pressure. All of that is true, but buried inside that story, visible only if you stop and look carefully, is the ghost of a big, slow, deliberate Virginian who turned his portrait to the wall in his own family's home and stayed with the Union because he believed in something larger than his blood. He never married. After the war, he was offered the same post-war commands and military governorships that Grant and Sherman collected. He refused most of them. He spent his last years in San Francisco commanding the Division of the Pacific, mostly managing the logistics of the Frontier Army, feeding and equipping soldiers in remote territories. Not glamorous. Not the work of a man chasing legacy. He died of a stroke in 1870 while dictating a letter in response to a newspaper editorial that had questioned his conduct at Chickamauga. He died mid-sentence, defending the men he commanded against a slander they did not deserve, which is exactly the kind of way George Thomas would die. His body was brought back east. His Virginia family did not attend the funeral. At Chickamauga, there is a monument to Thomas. It stands on Snodgrass Hill, the exact spot where he held the line in September 1863 while the Union Army escaped. It is a large, powerful monument. His statue stands with his hand raised, as if ordering his men to hold, as if the gesture has been frozen in stone so the world will never forget the posture of a man who refused to move. But the story of Chattanooga, the story of a general who refused a dangerous order because he knew his men weren't ready, who then watched those same men do the impossible when the moment finally arrived, that story does not have a monument. It should. Grant once said that the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get to him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving. It is a beautiful philosophy. It is also, by itself, incomplete. Thomas understood the thing that completes it. Before you strike, make sure the hand holding the hammer is strong enough to swing it. He waited because he knew. He moved because his men were ready. He watched them go up a ridge they were told not to climb because he saw in an instant what the orders couldn't anticipate. And when it was over, he gave credit to no one and took none for himself. On November 25, 1863, the Army of the Cumberland took a ridge that could not be taken in a battle that was not designed for them by soldiers who had been told they were the diversion. They were not the diversion. They were the answer. And the general who made them ready for that answer was standing in the valley below, watching them go up. Not saying a word, understanding before anyone else that the silence of absolute confidence can be louder than any order ever shouted. Some men fight to be remembered. George Thomas fought because it was right. History forgot him anyway. That is its loss.